The moment came without ceremony. No speeches, no flags, just the dull metallic click of a rifle bolt sliding into place and the sudden understanding that everything he had ever been was about to end. Corporal Ernst Richter of the Wehrmacht felt his legs give out beneath him as 3 American soldiers emerged from the tree line, their weapons raised, their faces hard and unreadable in the fading October light of 1944. He was 23 years old. He had been separated from his unit for 2 days, wandering through the French countryside with an empty canteen and a rifle he'd already thrown into a ditch because holding it felt like carrying his own death warrant. Now here he was, hands trembling above his head, throat too dry to speak, waiting for the bullet he believed was inevitable. The Americans shouted something he couldn't understand. Their voices were sharp, aggressive, efficient. One of them stepped forward and yanked the sidearm from Ernst's belt with such force it nearly pulled him to the ground. Another rifled through his pockets, pulling out a sodden identity booklet, a photograph of his younger sister, a few coins. They spoke to each other in clipped phrases, their eyes never leaving him. Ernst tried to read their faces for signs of mercy or rage, but found only exhaustion mirrored back at him. These were not the cartoon villains his officers had described. They were tired men doing a job they no longer believed in. But that did not mean they would spare him. Ernst had heard the stories, whispered in the trenches, passed along like contagion. Prisoners who never made it to the rear. Bodies found in ditches. Revenge taken quietly where no officers could see. He had heard what his own side did. He had seen it. And now he stood on the other side of that terrible equation, wondering if the mathematics of cruelty operated the same way in every army. They pushed him forward. His boots caught on roots and stones. The forest smelled of rot and wet earth and something metallic he couldn't name. One of the soldiers prodded him in the back with the barrel of a rifle, not cruelly but with the same indifference one might show livestock. Ernst stumbled, caught himself, kept walking. Every step felt like the last one he would take. His mind began to fracture. Part of him was here in this forest, feeling the cold sweat down his spine. Another part was already gone, already floating somewhere above the trees, watching his own death from a safe distance. He thought of his mother. She would receive a letter, missing in action, presumed dead. She would hold it in her kitchen and sink into a chair, and the light would go out of her face. His sister would marry, have children, forget his voice. He would become a photograph on a mantle. Her name mentioned less and less until one day no one would mention it at all. The thought was unbearable and strangely calming at the same time. If he was already dead in their minds, then perhaps dying here would be no great violence, just the conclusion of something already written. They walked for an hour, maybe 2. Time had stopped meaning anything. The light bled out of the sky. The Americans said less and less. Eventually they reached a clearing where several other prisoners sat in the mud, behind a coil of barbed wire strung between wooden posts driven into the ground. No tents, no shelter, just men sitting in their own filth, staring at nothing. An improvised holding pen, a place to keep human beings until someone decided what to do with them. Ernst was shoved through a gap in the wire. He fell to his knees. No one helped him up. No one looked at him. There were maybe 15 prisoners here. Germans, a few Italians, boys and old men. All of them had the same expression, the hollow-eyed stare of people who had stopped expecting tomorrow. Ernst crawled to a spot near the edge of the enclosure and sat with his back against a post. The wire dug into his shoulder blade, but he didn't move. Moving required energy he no longer had. Moving required hope. An American guard stood 20 meters away, leaning on his rifle, smoking a cigarette. His face was shadowed beneath his helmet. Ernst watched him and tried to guess what kind of man he was. Young, thin, tired. Beyond that, impossible to say. Did he have a family? Did he hate Germans the way Ernst had been taught to hate the enemy? Or was he just another exhausted soldier trying to survive until the war decided to let him go home? The guard flicked his cigarette into the dirt and ground it out with his boot. Then he turned and walked away into the gathering darkness. Ernst realized with a sick lurch in his stomach that he had been hoping the guard would shoot him, that it would be over quickly. But there would be no quick ending here. only waiting, only the slow, gnawing realization that death might not come tonight or tomorrow, but would hang over him indefinitely, stretching time into something unbearable. He closed his eyes, tried to sleep. Couldn't. The moment came without ceremony. No speeches, no flags, just the dull metallic click of a rifle bolt sliding into place and the sudden understanding that everything he had ever been was about to end. Corporal Ernst Richter of the Wehrmacht felt his legs give out beneath him as 3 American soldiers emerged from the tree line, their weapons raised, their faces hard and unreadable in the fading October light of 1944. He was 23 years old. He had been separated from his unit for 2 days, wandering through the French countryside with an empty canteen and a rifle he'd already thrown into a ditch because holding it felt like carrying his own death warrant. Now here he was, hands trembling above his head, throat too dry to speak, waiting for the bullet he believed was inevitable. The Americans shouted something he couldn't understand. Their voices were sharp, aggressive, efficient. One of them stepped forward and yanked the sidearm from Ernst's belt with such force it nearly pulled him to the ground. Another rifled through his pockets, pulling out a sodden identity booklet, a photograph of his younger sister, a few coins. They spoke to each other in clipped phrases, their eyes never leaving him. Ernst tried to read their faces for signs of mercy or rage, but found only exhaustion mirrored back at him. These were not the cartoon villains his officers had described. They were tired men doing a job they no longer believed in. But that did not mean they would spare him. Ernst had heard the stories, whispered in the trenches, passed along like contagion. Prisoners who never made it to the rear. Bodies found in ditches. Revenge taken quietly where no officers could see. He had heard what his own side did. He had seen it. And now he stood on the other side of that terrible equation, wondering if the mathematics of cruelty operated the same way in every army. They pushed him forward. His boots caught on roots and stones. The forest smelled of rot and wet earth and something metallic he couldn't name. One of the soldiers prodded him in the back with the barrel of a rifle, not cruelly but with the same indifference one might show livestock. Ernst stumbled, caught himself, kept walking. Every step felt like the last one he would take. His mind began to fracture. Part of him was here in this forest, feeling the cold sweat down his spine. Another part was already gone, already floating somewhere above the trees, watching his own death from a safe distance. He thought of his mother. She would receive a letter, missing in action, presumed dead. She would hold it in her kitchen and sink into a chair, and the light would go out of her face. His sister would marry, have children, forget his voice. He would become a photograph on a mantle. Their name mentioned less and less until one day no one would mention it at all. The thought was unbearable and strangely calming at the same time. If he was already dead in their minds, then perhaps dying here would be no great violence, just the conclusion of something already written. They walked for an hour, maybe 2. Time had stopped meaning anything. The light bled out of the sky. The Americans said less and less. Eventually they reached a clearing where several other prisoners sat in the mud, behind a coil of barbed wire strung between wooden posts driven into the ground. No tents, no shelter, just men sitting in their own filth, staring at nothing. An improvised holding pen, a place to keep human beings until someone decided what to do with them. Ernst was shoved through a gap in the wire. He fell to his knees. No one helped him up. No one looked at him. There were maybe 15 prisoners here. Germans, a few Italians, boys and old men. All of them had the same expression, the hollow-eyed stare of people who had stopped expecting tomorrow. Ernst crawled to a spot near the edge of the enclosure and sat with his back against a post. The wire dug into his shoulder blade, but he didn't move. Moving required energy he no longer had. Moving required hope. An American guard stood 20 meters away, leaning on his rifle, smoking a cigarette. His face was shadowed beneath his helmet. Ernst watched him and tried to guess what kind of man he was. Young, thin, tired. Beyond that, impossible to say. Did he have a family? Did he hate Germans the way Ernst had been taught to hate the enemy? Or was he just another exhausted soldier trying to survive until the war decided to let him go home? The guard flicked his cigarette into the dirt and ground it out with his boot. Then he turned and walked away into the gathering darkness. Ernst realized with a sick lurch in his stomach that he had been hoping the guard would shoot him, that it would be over quickly. But there would be no quick ending here, only waiting, only the slow, gnawing realization that death might not come tonight or tomorrow, but would hang over him indefinitely, stretching time into something unbearable. He closed his eyes, tried to sleep, couldn't. Thirst became the only thing, not fear of death, not memory, just the burning, all-consuming need for water. Ernst's thoughts narrowed to a single point. His tongue was a piece of leather in his mouth. His throat felt like it had been lined with broken glass. Every breath hurt. Every swallow was agony. He watched the guards drinking from their canteens and felt something beyond envy, a kind of animal rage. Not at them specifically, at the universe, at the cruel cosmic joke that had brought him here. He tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Only a kind of fevered half-consciousness where everything blurred together. Day into night, night into day. He lost track of time completely, hours or days. He didn't know anymore, didn't care. Other prisoners around him had started to look the same way. Hollow, distant. Some had stopped moving altogether, just sitting with their backs against the posts, staring at nothing. Ernst wondered if they were dead, and no one had noticed yet, or if this was what dying looked like, a slow fade, a gradual disappearance. He thought about his own death again, but differently now. Before it had seemed sharp and sudden, a bullet, a quick, violent end. Now he understood it would be slow, grinding, his body shutting down piece by piece until there was nothing left. He thought about which would be worse and couldn't decide. On what might have been the third day, or the fourth, a fight broke out. Two prisoners arguing over nothing, over space, over some imagined slight. Their voices rose and then they were on the ground, wrestling in the mud like children. It was pathetic, desperate. The guards watched, but didn't intervene. Let them tire themselves out. Let them waste what little energy they had left. Ernst watched too and felt nothing. No pity, no disgust. Just the same flat emptiness that had settled over everything. Eventually the fight ended. Both men lay in the mud, breathing hard, and after a while one of them started to cry. Quiet sobs that shook his whole body. No one comforted him. No one had anything left to give. Ernst closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the light had changed. Evening. He had lost hours. His mind was fracturing. He could feel it happening. Thoughts coming apart, memories bleeding into each other. He saw his mother and his sister and his father all at once, all standing together in the kitchen of their house, and they were looking at him with such sadness that he wanted to scream but couldn't make a sound. Then they were gone, and he was staring at the wire again, and the moon was rising, and he realized with perfect clarity that he was going to die here in this mud and no one would know and no one would care. That night something shifted. Ernst felt it, a kind of letting go. His body had been fighting, clinging to life with a desperate animal instinct, but now it stopped. He stopped. He lay very still and felt his heartbeat slow and thought, this is it. This is how it ends. Not with violence, not with drama, just a quiet surrender. He thought about his life and was surprised to find he felt no regret. Everything that had happened. He had loved and been loved, had seen beauty, had felt joy. That it was ending now seemed neither fair nor unfair, just the way things were. He closed his eyes and waited for sleep to take him, but sleep didn't come. Instead he heard footsteps, boots on dirt, coming closer. Ernst's eyes opened. His heart, which had been so slow, suddenly hammered in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been expecting since the beginning. A guard was walking along the perimeter of the wire, moving slowly, deliberately, and even in the darkness, Ernst could tell the guard was looking at the prisoners, studying them one by one. Ernst lay very still, tried to make himself invisible, but the footsteps stopped. Directly in front of him, he could see the guard's boots. American boots, worn leather, mud-caked. He forced himself to look up. The guard was young, maybe younger than Ernst. His face was shadowed, but Ernst could see his eyes. Dark, tired, human. The guard stared down at him for a long moment, and Ernst stared back, and neither of them moved. Ernst waited for the rifle to come up, for the barrel to point at his head, for the explosion that would end everything. But the guard just stood there, looking, and Ernst understood with a terrible clarity that the guard was deciding, right now, in this moment, whether Ernst would live or die. The power was absolute, the choice arbitrary. Ernst felt no fear anymore, just a kind of numb fascination. He waited. The guard's hand moved, reached for something at his belt. Ernst closed his eyes. This was it. But instead of a gunshot, there was a soft metallic sound, the clink of metal on metal. Ernst opened his eyes. The guard was holding a canteen. He unscrewed the cap slowly, never taking his eyes off Ernst. Then he did something Ernst would remember for the rest of his life. He knelt down in the mud beside the wire and held the canteen out through the gap, said nothing, just held it there. Ernst stared at it, didn't understand, couldn't process what was happening. The guard gestured with the canteen, a small impatient movement. Take it. Ernst's hand moved on its own, trembling. He reached out and took the canteen and brought it to his lips and drank. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. He drank and drank until the guard reached out and gently pulled the canteen back. Not cruelly, just taking it back. Ernst lowered his hand and looked at the guard, and the guard looked back, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not friendship, just recognition. Two human beings seeing each other across a gulf of violence and horror. Then the guard stood up, screwed the cap back on his canteen, walked away. Ernst sat in the mud, water dripping from his chin, and cried. Days became weeks. Weeks became something approaching routine. Ernst learned to navigate the camp, learned which guards were cruel and which were indifferent and which, occasionally, showed small, unexpected kindnesses, learned how to make his rations last, how to trade cigarettes for extra bread, how to stay warm at night when the temperature dropped below freezing. He survived. But surviving was not the same as living. He moved through each day in a kind of fog, doing what was required but feeling disconnected from it all, like he was watching himself from a distance. The other prisoners noticed. One of them, a man named Klaus, who had been a teacher before the war, tried to talk to him, asked him where he was from, what he did before, whether he had family. Ernst answered, but his voice sounded flat even to his own ears. Klaus persisted, told stories, shared news from home when letters arrived, tried to pull Ernst back into the world. Ernst appreciated it but couldn't fully engage. Something inside him had broken, or maybe just shifted, and he didn't know how to shift it back. At night, he dreamed of the clearing, of the wire, of the guard kneeling in the mud with the canteen. The dream was always the same. The guard would hold out the canteen and Ernst would reach for it, but just before his fingers touched the metal, he would wake up, heart pounding, the taste of water ghost-like on his tongue. He didn't understand why this moment haunted him more than any of the other horrors he had witnessed, the battles, the death, the friends he had lost. But it did. It haunted him. Winter came. The camp became a frozen, miserable place. Prisoners huddled together for warmth. Some died, pneumonia, dysentery, despair. Ernst watched men give up, and it frightened him because he understood how easy it would be to join them, to just stop fighting, to let the cold take him. But every time he felt himself slipping, he would remember the water, the weight of the canteen, the guard's eyes, and something in him would clench and hold on. He didn't know why, didn't know what he was holding on for. But he held on. One day in late January, the guards announced the war was almost over. Germany was collapsing. Hitler was dead or dying. Berlin was surrounded. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. Some prisoners celebrated, others wept. Ernst felt nothing. The war ending didn't mean he could go home, didn't mean any of this had mattered. He sat in his tent and stared at his hands and wondered what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. In March, the camp was liberated by the formal end of hostilities. Prisoners were interviewed, sorted. Arrangements were made for repatriation, Ernst waited his turn, answered questions, gave his name and rank and hometown. The Allied officer processing him was kind, said Ernst would be going home soon, said he was lucky. Ernst nodded and said nothing. Lucky. The word felt obscene. Finally, in April, Ernst was put on a train heading east, back toward Germany, back toward what was left of his country. He sat by the window and watched the landscape scroll past. Destroyed cities, burned fields, refugees on the roads carrying everything they owned. The devastation was incomprehensible. He thought about the guard, wondered if he was on a different train heading back to America, wondered if he was whole, if the war had broken him the way it had broken Ernst, wondered if he ever thought about the moment in the clearing, if it had meant anything to him. Ernst wanted to find him, wanted to say thank you, wanted to understand why. But he didn't even know the guard's name, didn't know what unit he had been with, didn't know anything except that he had been young and tired and human. It wasn't enough. When Ernst finally reached his hometown, he barely recognized it. Half the buildings were gone. The streets were filled with rubble, but his family's house was still standing. His mother opened the door and screamed and fell on him weeping. His sister stood behind her, older now, not the little girl he remembered. They pulled him inside and fed him and asked 1,000 questions, and he answered as best he could, but couldn't tell them the truth. Couldn't tell them about the mud and the wire and the waiting. Couldn't tell them about the guard. It felt too fragile, too sacred. Like speaking it aloud would break it. So he said he had been lucky, said he had been treated well, said he was fine. And his mother believed him because she needed to, because the alternative was unbearable. Ernst tried to rebuild his life, got a job, married a woman who had lost her husband in the war, had children, lived an ordinary life that from the outside looked like recovery. But inside he carried the war with him, carried the moment in the clearing. It lived in his chest like a second heart, beating quietly beneath everything else. Some nights he would lie awake beside his wife and think about the guard, and wonder if he was lying awake too, somewhere across the ocean, thinking about Ernst. Probably not. Probably the guard had moved on, had forgotten, had filed that moment away with 1,000 other moments and gotten on with his life. But Ernst couldn't forget, didn't want to forget, because forgetting felt like a betrayal of something he couldn't name. Years passed. Ernst's children grew, his hair turned grey. Germany rebuilt itself into something new and strange and uncomfortable. The war became history, something in textbooks, something young people couldn't understand. Ernst rarely spoke about it. When people asked, he would say he had been a prisoner, that he had been lucky that he survived. Nothing more. But inside, the war never ended. Inside, he was still in that clearing, still waiting, still seeing that young American guard kneel in the mud. He began to write about it, not for publication, just for himself, pages and pages trying to capture what it had felt like, the fear, the thirst, the moment the canteen appeared. He wrote and rewrote the same scene 100 times, never satisfied, never quite able to express the weight of what had happened. His wife found the pages once and asked him about them. He told her it was nothing, just old memories. She didn't press. She had learned not to press, but she worried. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. In 1983, nearly 40 years after the war ended, Ernst saw a newspaper article about an American veterans group touring Germany. They were visiting old battlefields, meeting former enemies, trying to make sense of what they had all been through. Ernst read the article 3 times, felt something stir in his chest, an impulse, a desperate, irrational hope. What if the guard was part of this group? What if Ernst could find him? What if after all these years he could finally say thank you? He knew it was impossible, knew the odds were astronomically against it, but the hope wouldn't let go. He contacted the organization sponsoring the tour, wrote them a letter explaining who he was, what he was looking for. He tried to describe the guard, but had so little to go on. Young, thin, dark eyes. It could have been anyone. Could have been 1,000 men, the organization wrote back. Said they would ask around, see if anyone remembered. Ernst waited. Weeks became months. He heard nothing. Of course he heard nothing. It had been a foolish hope, a desperate wish. He tried to let it go, but couldn't. Then in November a letter arrived, postmarked from Pennsylvania. Ernst stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page, typed, from a man named James Sullivan. The letter was brief, said he had heard through the Veterans Organization that someone was looking for an American soldier who had been at a POW enclosure in France in October 1944. Said he thought he might be that soldier. Said he remembered. Said he had never forgotten. Ernst read the letter 5 times. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the paper. James Sullivan, that was his name. After 40 years, Ernst finally knew his name. He sat down at his kitchen table and wrote back immediately. His English was poor, but he did his best. Told James what the water had meant. Told him it had saved his life, not just physically, but in some deeper way. Told him he had carried that moment for 40 years and wanted to say thank you, wanted to understand why. James wrote back a month later. His letter was longer, more detailed. He said he remembered the night clearly. Said he had been walking the perimeter of the enclosure and had seen Ernst lying in the mud and had thought he was already dead. But then Ernst had opened his eyes and James had seen something in his face. Not defiance, not pleading, just exhaustion. Just a human being at the absolute end of everything. James said he had been about to walk away, that he wasn't supposed to give prisoners water, that there were rules. But he had looked at Ernst and thought about his own younger brother who was serving in the Pacific, thought about what he would want someone to do if his brother was lying in the mud somewhere on the other side of the world. So he had given Ernst the water, had made a choice. James said he had thought about it many times over the years, had wondered if Ernst had survived, had wondered if that one small decision had mattered. Now he knew. Ernst wrote back. They began to correspond regularly. Long letters crossing the Atlantic, 2 old men trying to make sense of a moment that had defined both their lives in ways they were only now beginning to understand. James said he had struggled after the war, had nightmares, had drunk too much for a while, had eventually gotten better but never quite felt whole, said the war had taken something from him he couldn't get back. Ernst understood, wrote that he felt the same way, that they were both ghosts haunting their own lives. In 1985 they arranged to meet. James flew to Germany. Ernst picked him up at the airport. They recognized each other instantly despite the decades, despite the gray hair and wrinkles and the weight of time. They embraced in the terminal, and both of them cried and people stared, but neither of them cared. They spent a week together. James stayed with Ernst and his family. They talked for hours, comparing experiences, filling in gaps, trying to construct a coherent narrative out of fragments and memory. James met Ernst's children and grandchildren, told them stories their father had never told them. Ernst took James to the old battlefields. They stood in fields that were now farmland and tried to remember where the wire had been, where the trucks had parked, where everything had happened. It was impossible. The land had healed. Nature had covered the scars. They were just 2 old men standing in a field, trying to resurrect ghosts. On the last day of James's visit, they sat in Ernst's kitchen drinking coffee and talking about the future. James said he was writing a book, memoir, about his experiences in the war. Asked if Ernst would mind if he included their story. Ernst said no. Said please do. Said maybe it would matter to someone. Maybe someone else who was struggling would read it and understand that even in the worst moments humanity could still break through. James finished his book 2 years later, sent Ernst a copy. Ernst read it in one sitting, cried through most of it. James had written about the war honestly, the fear, the violence, the moral compromises, and in the middle of it all was their story, the clearing, the wire, the canteen. James had written it with such care, such tenderness, had called it the moment that saved him as much as it had saved Ernst. Ernst didn't understand what he meant at first, but then James explained in another letter, said that after the war he had been haunted by all the things he had done, all the death, all the cruelty he had witnessed and participated in and failed to stop, had felt like he was drowning in it. But remembering the moment with Ernst had been a lifeline, had proven to himself that he was still human, still capable of mercy. That one decision had become the thing he held on to when everything else threatened to pull him under. Ernst understood then. They had saved each other, not just physically but spiritually, had given each other proof that goodness still existed, that even in hell small acts of grace were possible. They continued to write, continued to visit when they could, built a friendship that was deeper than friendship, something forged in fire, something unbreakable. Ernst's wife died in 1991. James came to the funeral, stood beside Ernst in the cemetery and held his hand while they lowered the casket into the ground. Said nothing, didn't need to, just stood there, present, solid, real. James died in 1998. Heart attack, quick and unexpected. Ernst got the call from James's daughter, flew to Pennsylvania for the funeral, stood at the grave and tried to find words for what James had meant to him but couldn't. How do you sum up a life? How do you explain that someone saved you in ways that had nothing to do with medicine or rescue? How do you say that a stranger's kindness 40 years ago had been the foundation on which you built everything that came after? Ernst tried, said a few words, talked about the clearing and the water and the way mercy can echo across decades. People listened politely, but he knew they didn't really understand. How could they? They hadn't been there, hadn't felt the weight of that moment. After the funeral, James's daughter gave Ernst a box, said her father had left instructions. Inside was James's old canteen, the same one, dented and scratched and worn, but unmistakably the same. There was a note attached in James's handwriting. For Ernst, so you know it was real. Ernst held the canteen and felt something break open inside him. He hadn't realized until that moment that part of him had always wondered, had always questioned whether his memory was accurate, whether he had romanticized or distorted what happened. But here was the proof, solid and real. The weight of it in his hands was the weight of everything. He took the canteen home, put it on a shelf in his study. Sometimes he would take it down and hold it and remember. Not just the clearing, not just the thirst, but everything that came after. The letters, the visits, the friendship, the way two lives had intersected in a moment of grace and been forever changed. Ernst lived another 12 years. In that time he spoke more openly about the war, gave talks at schools, told students about what he had experienced, about the horror, but also about the moments of unexpected humanity, about James and the canteen and the way one decision can ripple forward through time. He showed them the canteen, let them hold it, told them it was the most valuable thing he owned, more valuable than any medal or trophy or possession, because it represented something that couldn't be taken away, proof that even in the darkest places, people could choose to be kind. Ernst died in 2010. He was 89 years old. His children buried him next to his wife. At the funeral, his granddaughter spoke. She was a young woman now, studying history at university. She told the story of the clearing, of the American Guard, of the water. She held up James's canteen for everyone to see, said her grandfather had made her promise to keep telling this story, to never let it be forgotten, because it mattered, because in a world that seemed determined to forget, to move on, to file away the past as something distant and irrelevant, this story remained urgent, remained necessary. She said her grandfather had believed that war revealed both the worst and the best of humanity, that it stripped away all pretense and left people naked before their own choices. And in that nakedness, some people chose cruelty and some people chose mercy. James Sullivan had chosen mercy. Her grandfather had carried that choice for 66 years, had built his life on top of it, had tried to honor it by living with integrity and compassion and gratitude. After the funeral, his children sorted through his belongings, found the letters from James, hundreds of them, found the manuscript Ernst had been working on for decades, trying to capture what the moment had meant, found photographs, documents, a lifetime of memory preserved in paper and ink. They donated everything to a museum. The museum created an exhibit, called it The Canteen, a story of humanity in war. People came from all over to see it, to read the letters, to look at the photographs, to hold the canteen and imagine what it must have felt like to be dying of thirst and have a stranger offer water. The exhibit traveled, Germany, France, the United States, thousands of people saw it. Many of them wrote in the guest book, said the story had moved them, had made them think about their own choices, about the small daily decisions that seem insignificant, but that ripple forward in ways we can never predict or fully understand. Some visitors were veterans. They stood in front of the canteen for long minutes. Some cried, some just stared. All of them understood in ways civilians couldn't that war is not just battles and strategy and politics. It's individual moments, individual choices, individual human beings trying to navigate impossible situations with whatever moral compass they have left. The story continues to circulate, gets retold, sometimes accurately, sometimes embellished, sometimes reduced to a simple fable about kindness. But the core remains: two men, one moment, one choice, and everything that followed. There are people alive today who never knew Ernst or James, but who think about them, who imagine themselves in that clearing, who ask themselves what they would have done. Would they have given the water, or would they have walked away? It's an impossible question. None of us know what we would do until we're there, until we're exhausted and afraid and just trying to survive ourselves, until mercy costs us something. But the story asks the question anyway, demands we contend with it. The canteen still exists, sits in a climate-controlled case in a museum in Berlin. Visitors can see it, but no longer hold it. It's too fragile now, too valuable. But people press their hands against the glass and try to feel the weight of it anyway, try to imagine the moment, the clearing, the wire, the guard kneeling in the mud, the hand reaching out, the water. Some museums now use the story in educational programs, ask students to write essays about moral choice during wartime, about the difference between obedience and conscience, about how small acts can carry enormous weight. The students take it seriously. They understand, perhaps better than previous generations, that the world is fragile, that cruelty is easy, that kindness requires courage. There are no neat conclusions here, no perfect moral lessons. Ernst survived, but the war still destroyed him in ways that never fully healed. James came home but carried ghosts for the rest of his life. The canteen saved a life but couldn't save the thousands who died in that war, or the thousands who died in wars before and after. One act of mercy doesn't redeem the horror, doesn't justify or explain or resolve anything, but it exists. It happened. In a clearing in France in October 1944, a young American soldier made a choice, gave water to a dying enemy, saw him as human, and that moment became a thread that connected two lives across decades and an ocean, became something both men held onto when everything else felt meaningless, became proof that even in hell, grace is possible. The story ends here, but not really, because every time someone hears it, every time someone thinks about it, it continues. Every time someone faces their own moment of choice, whether to be cruel or kind, whether to see another person as human or as enemy, whether to walk away or kneel down, the story is there, a quiet whisper, a reminder that our choices matter, that they ripple forward, that we are always deciding in small ways and large what kind of world we want to live in. Ernst is gone, James is gone, but the canteen remains, and the question it asks remains. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Leave behind a question, a story, a challenge to the next generation to do better, to choose mercy when mercy costs something, to see each other, to remember that we are all, in the end, just flesh and fear and hope, just people trying to survive, just strangers who might in the right moment kneel down and offer water,